On the afternoon of the 22nd of November 1963, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy left her house in Hyannisport. She was alone as she walked along the pathway to the beach, her feet sinking into the soft sand. She had just received word from Dallas that her son, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, had been killed. On the beach, she paced up and down, fighting her grief, until she was fully in control. During the days that followed, she knew that her family would look to her as they had always looked to her for strength and encouragement. She was determined that they would not look in vain.
No, she's always very strong in a crisis. I think she's always steeled herself to not fall apart in a crisis because I think it's a very bad example for her children and for other people. And she's always had the philosophy that she's had so much in her life that to have a tragedy is not something that you fall apart on. That's life. If you don't have any tragedies, then life isn't fair at all. So she went to Mass and prayed and accepted it.
Faith has been, of course, a great comfort and a great inspiration. I think it's the greatest gift. As I said to one of my grandchildren a little while ago, it's the greatest gift. God has given me many gifts through the years, nearly every gift, I think. And still, I think that's the greatest because I've always trusted him. No matter what has happened, I've always been firm in my belief that he would give me the graces, he would give me the strength to bear these tragedies, and that everything would, that we'd go along. And I think that's very important for a mother, because if a mother collapses or a mother submits to discouragement, then what does a family do?
Well, I don't think she's really ever... a day goes by when she's not reminded or conscious of the tragedies of all my brothers and my sisters as well. But one goal that she established was that she was going to live for the living, and I'm sure you probably have heard her make that comment. And I think that this has been something which has been terribly meaningful to all the other children and to all the grandchildren as well. And I think all of us are very conscious of that sadness and tragedy has been a part of her life. But she every time you meet her or with her or talk with her, you're very much conscious of the sort of the joy of existence in life. She hasn't got time for self-pity. And I think during the most difficult times of tragedy in our family, she's been the one that's kind of lifted us all up. And I think this has been part of the reason why we're always not only in love with her, but have such respect for her.
The Kennedy story began in the port of Boston, where Irish emigrants came in their hundreds of thousands during the potato famine of the 1840s. Among them were two men from the county of Wexford, Patrick Kennedy and Thomas Fitzgerald. The early years in Boston were not easy for the Irish newcomers. Crowded into slums along the waterfront, they were happy to accept any work, live in any conditions. Thomas Fitzgerald's son, John, was born in a tenement house. His playgrounds as he grew up were the dockside streets and alleys. But he knew that beyond the waterfront was a world of opportunity, and that the son of a penniless immigrant could still hope to reach the highest position in the city of Boston. In December 1905, John Fitzgerald achieved his ambition and was elected mayor of Boston. By his side throughout the campaign was his 15-year-old daughter Rose, reveling in the colour and excitement of Boston politics. And even Mayor Fitzgerald's opponents had to admit he was colourful. never happier than when singing Sweet Adeline to his supporters in his fine tenor voice.
Well, I think it probably started with my father because, of course, he was in politics and all his life. And my sons were at Harvard. They used to, in Cambridge, which is very near Boston, and they used to lunch with him every week. And he loved to talk about Boston. He loved to talk about the history of this country. And Boston is, of course, replete with things of historical interest. It's very near Concord and Lexington. So they grew up in that atmosphere where they were interested in history, they were interested in government, and then they went to Washington at an early age, just as little boys seeing Congress and seeing the Senate. And of course, my father had been in Congress. So it was sort of a natural interest. And then, of course, I too was very much intrigued with the politics, I suppose you'd call it. And we used to discuss a great many of these things at the noonday meal. If you notice now on the door here in the hall, the Declaration of Independence is pasted up there, it's pinned up there. And I cut it out of the paper July 4th, and then as the grandchildren came along, I used to talk to them about it a little bit, and what names were on the paper, and how brave and how fearless the colonists were to assert their independence under very difficult circumstances. And then we picked out a few names of people who had come from Boston, who had come from Massachusetts. So everything sort of tied in to stimulate their interest and their devotion, really, because as the boys grew older, their father told them that they owed a great deal to this country. And then sometimes I used to quote the words of St. Luke, of those to whom much is given, much is expected, and that they had these advantages, so they should use them for the common good, or for humanity, or for something worthwhile, and not spend their time sunning on the Riviera or sailing. Yeah. So that was instilled into their minds and hearts when they were quite young. And fortunately, they accepted it, and they, of course, themselves were interested. Jack especially didn't have very good health, so he read a great deal. And then he used to discuss these some of these figures of history with us at the dining room table, which was sort of the mecca for everyone to expound their views. Of course, he was not, none of us were limited to American history. We used to discuss France and England and Canada.
Did you feel the fact that the family had this Catholic and Irish background, that this would necessarily limit the kind of political ambitions that you could have in America?
Well, not in America as a whole. Of course, there had never been a Catholic president, as you knew, so there was a certain prejudice against that idea. I can remember campaigning myself and meeting someone in the South and suggesting that she vote for Jack. It was a woman I met on the street. And she said, I ain't going to have no pope coming over here running things. And that was final. And so they had that sort of fear, I suppose, or prejudice, or whatever it was. They didn't want a big Catholic influence. They didn't want the Roman Catholic Church.
In October 1914, Rose Fitzgerald married Joseph Kennedy and came to live in this house in Boston. It is preserved today with all its original furniture, including the bed where the future President of the United States was born. For Rose Kennedy, motherhood brought complete fulfillment.
Some people find it rather dull, but I think it's quite challenging and tremendously interesting to think that you have this precious little baby, and what you say is going to influence him for the rest of his life and for time and for eternity, and he in his turn is going to influence other people. And he hears the first words from his mother. It's she who tells him what's right and wrong in childish language at first, and then of course in firm precepts later. And then as they grow older, you share their triumphs at school or on the football field or the baseball field. And then afterwards, perhaps they go to school, to college, and then you take a part in that, and that broadens your knowledge and expands your interests. I think that it's the greatest role a woman can have.
The dining room table here, as in all subsequent Kennedy homes, was the main forum for discussion and instruction. Mrs. Kennedy's daughter Eunice remembers these discussions vividly.
Well, my mother, of course, was and is a very devout woman, and she was anxious that all of us have a strong feeling about our religion. So when we used to sit around at the dining room table, I can remember she'd talk about, say, the feast day, the Feast of the Assumption, and she'd say, now, what is the Feast of the Assumption? What does it mean? And what about the Blessed Mother? Or the Feast of the Ascension or Transfiguration. And she'd talk about Christmas and Bethlehem, and then she'd go to the map and show us where Israel was and where the holy places were. So constantly at meals, she would refer to religious subjects. And then very often, she'd take us into town. I can remember being about 5 or 6 years old, going in for ice cream, and then always on the way home, she'd stop at church and you'd make a visit.
I used to take them walking in the morning before they were old enough to go to school, because the nurse would be busy with those days we didn't have diapers, we didn't have the formulas prepared. At any rate, the nurse would be very busy, so I would take them walking, and then we would stop in at a church very often, because I would I wanted them to know that church was something for every day in the week. It wasn't just for Sunday, just a special day or special hour that you could pray or you could talk to God anytime, and he would be there, he would listen to you, he would give you advice or sympathy or whatever it was you felt you needed. And it was a good habit for them to cultivate when they were young. Well, Joe and Jack were older boys when they were little, because we lived very near the church and could walk to the church. And Jack was so young that he could hardly take the book, you see, from one side of the altar to the other, because he was hardly tall enough to raise it up. And then of course, as we moved, it meant that they couldn't walk to church. So it's like down here, for instance, they couldn't walk. And it was a disadvantage. While in the early days, it was very easy for them. And then I did mention that Joe was an older boy on New Year's Eve in Switzerland, which thrilled me, because I thought he'd be out at a gay party. And he was at a gay party before and afterwards, but he did manage to get away from midnight mass without any solicitation on my part. And so they came forward with these surprises, with these little acts of the right thing, of doing the right thing, which was really a great joy to us.
Did the president?
But they, of course, as I said, they weren't all little angels either. They got into plenty of difficulty, from which their father extricated them. And in his publicity, he's pictured as a very tough, hard man, but with the family and with his children, he was typically Irish, gentle and affectionate.
And with you also?
And with me. Oh, yes, definitely.
Well, they had a really extraordinary relationship. My mother's writing her autobiography, and I said to her only last night, I said, Mother, I've read the book, and you asked me for the criticism, and I just think the main criticism is you don't ever criticize Dad in the book. How can you write 855 pages and never criticize Dad? And she said, well, what do you want me to criticize about him? He was a perfect husband, and he was a perfect father. And I said, but nobody will believe you can be married for 50 years and not fight. And she said, well, I had nothing to fight about. He did everything. When I had a baby, he'd send me, and I'd be in the hospital, he'd send me over special meals from a hotel so that I could eat well. When I was tired out after with the children, he'd take me on a trip. After I had each baby, he'd give me a little gift, and he would he would help me raise them. He'd go and visit the schools before they went, especially the boys' schools. And I said, well, Mother, when you wanted to go out to dinner parties, he didn't like to go out a lot, weren't you? Now you're going out a good deal more. Isn't that you find? Some people say you're a late bloomer from 72 to 82. You've been going out a great deal more. Haven't you been frustrated all those years? And she said, not at all. She said, I made up my mind that if he wanted, when he was around, he wanted to stay in, that's fine. But he took me to meet Toscanini, and he'd take me to the concerts every Saturday night. And when we lived in France, at the south of France, we went out sufficiently there. Maybe you don't remember it when we were growing up, but later on we did. And I balanced the times he wanted to stay at home with the times that he'd take me out. There is nothing to criticize about your father.
In 1926, the Kennedys went house hunting in Hyannisport. At that time, Hyannisport, with its sandy beaches and elegant houses, was becoming a rich man's playground. But by 1926, Joe Kennedy himself was a very rich man indeed, with interests in everything from shipbuilding to movie making. And while the Kennedy fortune was growing, so was the Kennedy family. In the summer of 1926, the two oldest, Joe and Jack, were 10 and 9 years of age. Then came Kathleen, Rosemary, Eunice, Patricia, and the baby Robert. Jean and Teddy were still to come. Already Rosemary was showing signs of mental retardation, the first real cloud on the family happiness. But the others were healthy and fiercely competitive, and they loved the swimming and sailing and the big, comfortable house overlooking the harbour.
Well, I do. My father was very competitive, and I can remember racing. I was quite a good sailor, and I used to race a good deal, maybe 14 races a week, and sometimes I'd come in second, and I'd be very pleased. And my father would just say, well, that's fine, why didn't you come in first?
Do you think that's a good attitude to it? Do you try and instill that into your children?
I think it was probably in our case, because we were a large family and we could buoy each other up. I think if you had an only child and you constantly said to him, why aren't you first? I think it might result in inferiority complexes.
You mentioned to me yesterday that I'd find your mother fairly tough when I spoke to her. And did you experience that growing up, that your mother was a very strong person at home?
I don't think I used the word tough. I think the word strong is a better description of my mother. And I think she's very well disciplined, and she's very... as you have found out, she's very interested in things that go on all the time. She took my children, for instance, last evening and showed them the Declaration of Independence and the different signatures and tried to point out what state these different people, John Hancock was from, Thomas Jefferson was from. So she tries to really keep up on everything all of the time, even with the next generation.
Were you conscious of her as a disciplining person at home? Somebody who imposed discipline or who managed?
Yes, she had, I think she was probably stronger disciplinarian than my father.
Would you have described...
But she was at home, of course, a good deal more than he was, but I think that's...
Would you have described your upbringing as strict?
I think I would, yeah. That's that Irish trait, isn't that? Most Irish mothers is pretty strict.
You're quoted as saying we were computerized at a very early age, but by a very compassionate computer. Is that true? What exactly do you mean by computerized?
Well, when I was describing my mother, I think she had a very definite schedule for all of us. We had all of us had our teeth straightened, for example. It took 7 years, but we all went to the dentist, 3 or 4 of us at a time, and we'd all sit and wait for each other, and we'd do that. And then we all had swimming lessons, and we'd go down on the beach and sit on the beach and take our turn. To the public beach, but we still took lessons. And we'd go to the club and take tennis lessons, and we'd go and sit and wait for our turn. So we had, I think, rather scheduled life. And my mother, I think's feeling was that we should do everything as well as we could and have the most opportunities, and then it was up to us. That sort of philosophy, and I think it paid off because everybody felt they had all the opportunities my parents could give, and if we were a failure, it was our own fault.
Your mother actually kept a card index on each one of you. What sort of things did she put on the card index? Did you ever see it yourself? Yes,
I was horrified. I took my children up to see the house where President Kennedy was born in Boston, and they had the card index on the little... in my mother's room, and my children looked to find out how old I was, and there it was in the card, and I haven't told them the truth all these years. So there was all the illnesses and the everybody's injections and shots, and so you never get a smallpox shot twice, that sort of thing.
Well, we were a very close-knit family, like so many other families. My early years, my father was in the diplomatic corps, so spent as much time as possible at home. Mother was home much more often. But I must say I gathered a great deal of sort of strength and sustenance from my brothers and from my sisters. And I hear Mother saying now that she spent a great deal of time with the older ones, but it seemed like she spent a great deal of time with the younger ones as well.
You're quoted as having said that Mother would have made a great featherweight. She had a mean right hand. Did you ever, are you speaking
Well, I
from
don't know
experience?
whether that quite would be a description I'd use, but she was a good disciplinarian. We received our whacks with a coat hanger or whatever during our early years, but justice was always fair, it was always immediate, and it was really never resented.
Well, I think if you bring up the eldest son right or the way you want the others to go, that is very important, because the younger ones watch him. If he comes in and shakes hands with the guests, the others will watch him in the doorway and they'll come in and do the same thing. If he goes to college, then they sort of think, well, they probably will, that's the natural thing to do. And I used to depend on him a lot to give advice or to give transmit my ideas to the others. If I thought a girl had too much lipstick, I would say, Joe, will you please tell her she's got too much lipstick? My daughter would pay more attention to him than she would to me, probably. Or smoking or anything like that, he would take her on very often. And so I think it's very important. It was in my case anyway, because the others had great. And Teddy said when he went to boarding school he was lonely, but he thought his two brothers had gone, probably were lonely too, but they had stuck it out, so he would stick it out.
Joseph, the eldest son, was the one who carried all his father's hopes and ambitions. He was sent to study at the London School of Economics, where he became attracted to socialism, rather to his father's dismay.
So Joe did learn a lot about socialism, and so when these ideas took root in this country and were expanded, my son had been acquainted with them and had that point of view. And then he, as we all know, or some of us know, he had these very heated arguments with his father when he came home from London, the capitalist system versus the socialist system. And it was very stimulating, and Joe had some very good ideas.
Did it upset you to see father and son?
No, because my husband knew that when he sent him there. And we just had a depression in this country, you see. And so some of the ideas that Joe had about sharing the wealth and about the wealth being distributed and all that sort of thing seemed to make a good deal of sense. And my husband knew that. He said if he had been Joe's age, he would have felt the same way Joe did. But he was brought up in the capitalist system, and this country had been wonderful to him. And so he felt the way he did. So, and I said to Joe, if you feel that way, sharing the wealth, why don't you give your sailboat away now and just go rowing or swimming like everybody else? And he said, oh, giving away one boat and dispensing with one boat wouldn't make a great deal of difference. So we all had a very pleasant, relaxing chat about it, you see. There was nothing tight or nothing bitter about it, you see.
In the late summer of 1944, young Joe Kennedy was killed in action. The news was a shattering blow to all the family, particularly to his father, who never fully recovered. It was left to Rose Kennedy to rally her children, to live for the living, as the mantle of heir apparent passed to her second son, Jack. Returning home as a war hero, Jack accepted his new position as the eldest son and began the long, slow haul towards the White House. While his father remained in the background, his mother threw herself wholeheartedly and very effectively into the campaign, organising tea parties and rallying the women's vote behind her son.
At that time, it was suggested that Jack have a tea party. I think it was Eunice who suggested that if some of the women met him, they might be more interested to work in the campaign. And the first tea party was a great success. And I spoke and Jack spoke. And the women did become interested and did volunteer their services and said that they would telephone to their friends and they would give small tea parties perhaps for other people to meet him. And it became rather a challenge for the women around and a matter of social significance. Did you go to a Kennedy tea, they would say, in one city? No, but there's going to be one in 2 weeks and I hope to go. And so it awakened quite a good deal of interest in the candidate, and a lot of volunteers, too, gave their services.
Yeah, she was marvellous. She was marvellous. It was then my father said to me one night, dinner to the girls, I'll tell you one thing, never have your picture taken with a baby and never follow your mother on the platform because she gives too good a speech. And it's quite true. I never do. But everybody was very excited. She would come to the receptions. There'd be about 1,500 women, and she'd come and she'd make a little speech about her, President Kennedy. Then President Kennedy would come in and he'd make this speech about the future of Massachusetts and what he thought he could do as a United States Senator. Then she'd move on and go to another state. She loves to campaign. It's not a chore. And she likes very much meeting people, I think. And she's great at it and really makes an effort. She works on her little speech beforehand. She works on her clothes. She's a perfectionist.
She was to take the same interest in the political careers of her other sons, especially Teddy, who is said to have inherited all the Irish charm of his singing grandfather, Mayor Fitzgerald.
Well, I always have to leave it up to others to sort of point out the similarities. I suppose we're our own worst judges on it. But I've, of course, been enormously interested in my grandparents and on both sides who were of Irish ancestry. And
you do a bit of singing like your grandfather?
Well, a few years ago I used to do a little. I remember one time was at an occasion when I was running for the Senate, and I sang, and I saw an old-timer at the back of the hall just shaking his head, and afterwards, when I went out, I was talking to my friend, and I said, "What did the old-timer say?" And he said, "Well, he voted for your grandfather for mayor and senator of the United States, and he's going to vote for you if you promise you'll never sing again." So I've been somewhat reluctant to do that.
I'd like to ask you about your mother's skill as a politician, because this has been often observed. I think Dave Power said she was the best politician of the lot. She used to, I believe, to comment to you after your television appearances about your appearance and the things that you said. Was this sort of helpful or effective?
Well, very. She does so even now, and did it with President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy as well. She'll call up on a word perhaps that's been mispronounced. She had a word the other day, shortlived, and I said it was short-lived, and it's short-lived. And so should correct me on little words like this and things like that, which only a mother can do, but which all of us, of course, need so much. And it was very valued. All the brothers would kind of joke with her about it, but she'd just stay right after us, and we all loved it.
She seemed to have lost none of that interest in politics. For instance, when I was about to interview your sister, Mrs. Shriver, she came in and she said, "Now don't forget to give a plug to Teddy."
I'm glad to see she's still out working.
These days, at the age of 83, Mrs. Kennedy lives quietly at her home in Hyannisport, and her public appearances are few enough. But the public have not forgotten her or her family, and Kennedy watching has become a major local industry. All day long, motor vessels leave the harbour filled with sightseers eager to see the Kennedy home and perhaps catch a glimpse of one of the fabled Kennedys themselves.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome on aboard the motor vessel Prudence. We have just left the Ocean Street dock, and for the next 60 minutes we'll be cruising through the waters of Hyannis Inner Harbor, Lewis Bay, and a short stretch of Nantucket Sound, and finally Hyannisport Harbor. As we leave the inner harbor, you will find that the wind becoming stronger. We would advise those of you with hats to make sure they're well secured. During last season, we lost 17 hats overboard and 1 hair apiece. So please make sure that they're well tied on. We're now approaching Hyannisport, and what we'll do is we'll hold just outside the harbor entrance. I'll point out the Kennedy homes and other points of interest to you. Then we'll turn off the PA and move in much closer. You can get a better look, take better pictures, and the deckhands will be around to answer any questions you might have. If you look directly out into the beach, you'll see a low Quonset hut structure, green in color. This is the glass covering for the late Ambassador Kennedy swimming pool. Directly over the top of that pool, you'll see 2 brown peaks, a white chimney coming from the left peak. That home belongs to our late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. To the left of the pool is a large white home. This one has 3 white peaks, a black shuttered window at the top of each peak. That home belongs to the late Ambassador Joseph Kennedy. To the left is another home. That belongs to late Senator Robert Kennedy. 2 homes over to the left of Robert's, right on the beach, is another large white home. That belongs to Stephen Smith. He married the former Miss Jean Kennedy. High up on the hill, to the left, on Squaw Island, you see the rooftop of one more home with one white chimney coming from it. That home belongs to Senator Ted Kennedy. Now we'll turn off the PA and move in closer. You can get a better look, take better pictures, and the deckhands will answer any questions you may have.
Inside the big house, hidden from the cameras and the binoculars, Rose Kennedy is at work on her autobiography, sorting letters and photographs from the past. Some of her memories are happy, like the years spent at the embassy in London when she acted as hostess to the King of England and presented her daughters at court. At the same time, she keeps up her lifelong work on behalf of the mentally retarded.
Millions of people across the United States who are mentally retarded. And it's quite interesting, if you mention it, how many people say, oh, I have a friend who had a retarded daughter. There was somebody in my family who was in that condition. And so now, of course, it has come out into the open, and these people are encouraged to get jobs and have been successful, and they have worked for the government. My son talked to Mr. Dillon, who was Secretary of the Treasury, and he hired some people in the Treasury Department to run elevators, run errands, and he was very pleased and said that there was he had no reservations about hiring them.
These were handicapped people themselves?
These were handicapped people. And then I've traveled different places. Like I went to Puerto Rico, for instance, and there they helped the people. They taught some of these people to work for the tourists, to take trays into the dining rooms, for instance, or again to carry bags or one thing or another, so that they were encouraged and were able to earn a livelihood in one way or another. So that we've been very pleased with the progress that has been made. And there's no stigma attached to it now. People used to be ashamed, or they used to be shy about discussing it, but now they come out in the open, and that's, of course, so much better for the children.
You, in fact, kept your daughter Rosemary at home
we
for a very
did
long
for a number
time.
of years, but then we found it was impossible. So now she's at a very good home with the nuns of St. Coletta, who... and these religious have been specially trained in that particular work. So, as I said, it's a big problem, and I'm very sympathetic towards mothers and fathers too, because of course if a child is home, she's constantly on the mind of a mother or father, because you never can tell. Like my daughter used to want to go out in a rowboat if she saw the other children go, and of course she couldn't go, she couldn't manage the oars. Sometimes she'd go to the post office with them, and then she'd decide she didn't want to come home with them. Well, that would be all right with an ordinary child, but with her, you couldn't tell in which direction she might wander off, or whether she'd be picked up in a car by someone. So it was a great worry. That's why some of my children have had camps during the summer for these children. Eunice has one now, and my daughter Jean, Mrs. Smith, and they have these children at camp.
When my brother Joe died in the war, we decided we'd do something to commemorate him, and we all agreed we wanted to do something for children because we all love children, and this was the field most neglected in this country. So we had, of course, kept Rosemary home till she was about 23 or 4 years of age, and I think that was a very wise decision. Research shows that children who do stay at home do make more progress, unless they're very severely retarded, and Rosemary was not that severely retarded. And the trend, of course, both in Ireland and our country, is to put them back into the community and give them services there. She was... went to England with us, and my mother had her presented at court, and she did not go to school over there, but she was tutored, and she could do very elementary things, and she's now lives in a cottage taken care of by the sisters, and she's very happy.
Does your mother go to see her?
Yes, constantly. She goes. I go 1 month, and she goes the following month, and we alternate.
But you've sort of taken over the responsibility for looking after her.
I'm delighted. She's my sister.
Every part of the house is filled with memories, especially the living room, where John F. Kennedy posed for photographs in front of the fireplace with his family on the morning of his election as President of the United States. Only one of her 4 sons is now left to her, Teddy. As the youngest son, she still looks on him as the baby of the family. But the death of the others means that he is now the eldest son as well, with the duty of carrying on the work left unfinished by his 3 dead brothers.
She teases us a lot, the younger ones, but she's and jokes and kids with us, but she's and never change. I find that I run around and doing little things for her, which I used to do when I was a small boy. It means absolutely no difference to her that I've been elected to the United States Senate for 10 years. When I get home, I'm just the youngest, and I better be busy about the things that need doing.
Would you or will you consult with her if you're thinking of going for the presidency?
Well, I don't know. I would think that her concerns are obviously would weigh on any decision. But I of course would make the decision myself, but the effect that it would have on her would have some impact. But that's going to be a decision of my own, and very much my own. But obviously, I'd want to at least give very heavy consideration the impact that it would have on her. She's been through a tremendous amount of suffering, and this obviously would be a factor. But again, it's my personal decisions would be very much influenced by the nieces and nephews as well. There are a number of different grandchildren. You've probably seen them running around here now these past few days, and they need attention.
I have the overwhelming feeling, even though your mother was very careful when I asked her about this, that she would in fact be happy for you to run.
Well, I'll have to watch the TV tape myself and make a judgment.
On the lawn outside the big house, a new generation is beginning to take over. Where once Mrs. Kennedy watched her children playing touch football, now she watches her children's children. As in the old days, a young man is employed to act as play leader, and the competition is keen. The families of 5 of her children have houses nearby, and there's always plenty of young life around the house.
Chris! Take out, Kevin.
The lawn is out of bounds in the early afternoon while grandmother rests after lunch. But for the rest of the day, they are free to come and go as they choose. There are 2 tennis courts for them and a little theatre in the basement where films are shown once a week. Despite the generation gap, she still enjoys their company and even goes for a swim each morning from the sandy beach.
We got it over.
You did.
We can't block.
You ran. You didn't.
Surrounded by so much life and activity, she never allows herself to become lonely or withdrawn. Yet she would hardly be human if she didn't constantly remember the children that played there and are now no more, the voices that are stilled forever. The church in Hyannis, where she attends Mass every morning, is equally full of memories. On weekdays, the church is almost empty. But on Sundays, it's crowded with worshippers, many of them on the lookout to see if there are any Kennedys among the congregation. Ethel Kennedy is usually one of the first to be spotted. As the late Robert Kennedy's wife, she spent many years under the glare of publicity. Another well-known face is that of Eunice Kennedy, who is known both in her own right and as the wife of former Peace Corps Director Sergeant Shriver, who ran for Vice President at the last election. The senior Mrs. Kennedy herself usually waits on in the church for a while, partly to avoid the crowds, and partly because, as the years go on, she has so many more people to pray for. A plaque in the church marks the pew where Jack used to worship. She prays for him, and for the others too. Robert, shot by an assassin. Kathleen, killed in an air crash. Joseph, in whose memory she and her husband erected the high altar of the church. It's a place of memories, but it's also the source of her strength. Before she leaves, she makes the Stations of the Cross and pauses before the 12th station, which shows the Blessed Mother standing beside her crucified Son.
Well, as I said, I've always felt that the heavier the cross, the more graces our Lord sends us. And then I have had devotion, of course, to Our Lady for a long time. And I did think of her watching her son, because I had devotion to the Stations of the Cross. And, of course, carrying the cross, she met him. And then, of course, she was present at the crucifixion. And I did think of that when Jack's casket was at the White House, in the, not in the White House, in the Rotunda in Washington, as I knelt there. And then again, Bobby's casket was on the, it was in St. Patrick's Cathedral. And again, I stood there as the Blessed Mother had stood at the time of the crucifixion.
You thought about this, actually, did you, at the time?
I knew she would give me the strength and the grace as I prayed there.
You mentioned that you found, you asked not only for the grace and strength, but also resignation.
Oh yes, resignation. But because, of course, it was a time of great frustration. I spent all my life, 25, 30, 40 years of my life, bringing up these children so they'd be strong, honest, capable men, self-sacrificing, devout, and then and they're willing to work for humanity, eager to work, to give their talents, and then so it was difficult.
Can you, one of the things of resignation is to try to perhaps to understand. Is there any understanding in this? Is God's will, you mentioned it as
it's
unscrutable.
God's will, yes. And it's happened, as I said, if you read the Trojan Women by Euripides 2,500 years ago, you see Hecuba mourning the death of her grandson in a war. And it goes all through history. And I've had some very happy moments, and I look at those and I accept the others. And I don't want to be a burden, and I won't be. No. So that's that. That's the end of that act.
Fine.
End of Act 3.
Your daughter Eunice mentioned that I should ask you about growing old gracefully.
Yeah, well, that's a new idea. I don't think I'll go into it. People can use their imagination.
Well, I think that's true about Mother having a place in history, but I don't really feel that she's in any way it's a sort of a false feeling or an identification. I think Mother will go down really probably in history as one of the very significant women of our time. But I think it'll be for all the right reasons. It'll be because she felt deeply about her family and about their upbringing, felt deeply about her faith and her religion, was completely devoted to the country. I mean, all sort of the Christian ideals, and I think, I'm sure I'm prejudiced, but that's all right with me. She's really an enormously extraordinary person. But she's a fun person, too. I mean, it's... and that, I think, is one of the reasons why I think all of us so devoted to her.
He's a textile industrialist from Pennsylvania, and he and his home became famous in the early 1960s when he rented his home out to the late